Things are playing out as we expected. We're still bottoming here the first half of calendar year 2024. It looks like we are still on track to exit the bottom and enter the new phase of growth as we get into the back half of 2024. And then 2025 is where we start hitting those new record all-time highs, expected record all-time highs for wafer fab equipment and for chip packaging equipment.
Welcome back to Chipstock Investor. Today, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite wafer fab equipment manufacturing companies, Lam Research. But before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's a free and easy way to support our channel by just hitting that subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Let's dive in to Lam Research. They recently had their Q3 2024 earnings release.
Yeah, let's dive into it. So Lam Research, ticker symbol LRCX, sits in one of those critical choke points in the semiconductor industry flow. You can see that in our industry flow chart here that Kasey so wonderfully put together for us almost a year ago now. And within that critical choke point, we have, of course, the Fab Five that control roughly 70% of all revenue in that segment of the industry. It's an oligopoly. If you want to manufacture chips, you have to buy equipment from the Fab Five. Lam Research, the number 3 player in the Fab Five as measured by revenue. Pretty diverse set of equipment spanning deposition and etch on either side of the lithography process, and then cleaning, metrology, and then packaging on the back end part. So after the wafers are manufactured and diced up into chips, Lam Research has some packaging equipment as well. You can see that divvied up here on this chart that we've been using from Applied Materials for the last couple of years. You can see roughly the market share there of Lam Research in green.
If you want a more in-depth guide to the semiconductor manufacturing and packaging equipment space, we have our industry manual, the Ultimate 2024 Guide, available on the Ko-fi shop. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And if you're a Discord member, you have that in the video manuals section of the Discord channel.
Okay, with that high level overview out of the way, Kasey, tell us about the high level numbers, because as you may know from our past videos and maybe from your own past research, Lam is in the midst of a slump, but perhaps maybe, just maybe, coming out of that slump. Are we there yet? Are we back to a new phase of growth for the company?
Revenue for this most recent quarter, nearly $3.8 billion, very similar to last quarter at $3.76 billion. And then the earnings per share, $7.79. It was only $6.01 in the same quarter last year. So big growth in their earnings per share. As you can see from this table provided by Lam, most metrics were flat quarter over quarter. Revenue, operating margin, gross margin, but they did still eke out a little bit of earnings per share growth, and that's due to share buybacks, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And we'll also discuss how in the earnings call, they specifically mentioned that the second half of 2024 and into 2025 is actually where we're going to see some significant growth.
Yeah, that's right. Management summed it up and said no meaningful change in the calendar year 2024 revenue profile. As we've been discussing with Applied Materials, ASML, the 2 largest of the Fab Five, but also KLA and Tokyo Electron, we are still in the midst of that cycle bottom. A lot of the chip fab customers that buy this equipment from Lam and friends in the Fab Five are trying to work with what they have at the moment as they gear up for the next phase of chip manufacturing growth. So what that means for Lam is we are still at the bottom. And so Lam making some investments ahead of that next wave of growth and managing their profit margins along the way, doing some stock buybacks as well. So long story short, Kasey, as we discussed in our video a couple months ago as to why Lam is one of our favorites to play the memory chip market, Of course, high bandwidth memory, HBM memory, stacked DRAM chips on top of each other to help fuel those NVIDIA GPUs. They need massive amounts of information to train AI algorithms. We actually made a pivot late last year and early this year away from position we had in Micron for a long time and instead allocated it to Lam. Given that they own so much of the actual manufacturing process IP for these memory chips, and as well as making some investments into getting into the logic chip part of the market as well.
To illustrate exactly what Nick's talking about here, let's take a look at the revenue mix from last quarter. You can see that the revenue circled there is memory at 48%, foundry at 38%. But take a look at this quarter's. Now, the March quarter revenue mix, memory at 44%, foundry 44%, logic 12%. Diversifying that revenue mix will continue for Lam.
Now, one of the top questions we get is the fab customers in China being a potential risk. You can see over 40% of revenue went to China. Lam management said that was in line with the big surge in lithography purchases that those customers in China made from ASML. So they also need the deposition and etch and clean equipment on either side of the lithography step from companies like Lam if they go out and buy the litho tools. So they did mention, though, that while revenue to China does remain high, this will start to decline as 2024 progresses and skew more towards the other geographic regions. We talked about this a bit more in depth in our last video on Lam Research. You can find the link to that in the description or here in the video.
We also discussed the diversification of Lam Research with not just equipment, but also this customer support business group. Revenue for that in the most recent quarter was 1.4 billion, down just a little bit from the last quarter and down from 1.6 billion same time last year. But ultimately, companies like Micron can't escape Lam. Even if they spend less on equipment, they're going to be using those fab services. Many of these manufacturers are reutilizing or repurposing some of their other equipment from Lam, but they still need some of this support from Lam to move that equipment around to new fabs or to a different fab or to reinstall that equipment.
Yeah, long story short, even in a downturn, Lam still makes a lot of revenue and still highly profitable. You can't say that for Micron. They were deep, deep, deep into the red during this nasty downturn over the last year. And that has left Lam in pretty good financial shape, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Cash balance at the end of this quarter, $5.6 billion. They've been able to repurchase $860 million worth of shares in the last quarter. That's what helped that earnings per share metric drive higher. So Lam is in very good shape. Before we get to the valuation of Lam Research, let's talk about the next quarter's guidance. You can see it's still a little bit sluggish headed into summer, but we do expect there to be some acceleration starting with that September quarter. The next quarter, you can see around 3.8 billion in revenue, expected gross margin around 47.5%, operating margin 29.5%, and the earnings per share at a little less at $7.50.
Yeah, ultimately, no change from our expectation, no change from Lam management's expectation that we talked about just a couple of months ago. Things are playing out as we expected. We're still bottoming here the first half of calendar year 2024. It looks like we are still on track to exit the bottom and enter the new phase of growth as we get into the back half of 2024. And then 2025 is where we start hitting those new record all-time highs, expected record all-time highs for wafer fab equipment and for chip packaging equipment. We're looking at something like 120 billion or more in 2025 and 2026 in each of those years for fab equipment. Lam could be sitting on significant growth and a significant increase in profit margins in the next year and a half or so.
So let's talk about valuation for Lam Research. The stock price pre-market on April 25th, 2024 was $865. So where does that put us, Nick, for valuation?
Okay. Yeah, we're looking a little out of whack here with valuation. 31 times trailing 12-month earnings per share. Certainly not a value if you're just simply looking at this metric. But remember, that's the trailing 12-month earnings metric. And in the last year, as we showed you, earnings have been down significantly from the last peak in 2022. So Lam is going to begin lapping last year's depressed earnings. And maybe we should just jump back to that previous slide. Remember, in this just reported quarter, $7.79, up from $6 and a penny in earnings per share during the March quarter of 2023. This trend is going to continue in each of the following quarters. So what does Lam actually trade for on expectations for this current year? So we shared this with you about a month ago when we talked about Tokyo Electron and Applied Materials, the two closest peers of Lam Research. We haven't updated this because it's in flux. Lam Research just reported, but trailing 12-month price to earnings down to 31 now for Lam, Applied down to about 20 roughly. We don't know the shape of the recovery still for the next year and a half. But based on very early expectations, we're looking at well under 30x earnings for Lam as we head into a significant growth cycle. So the long story short here, Kasey, this is why we liked Lam and reallocated it as our bet on the memory chip market. We think it's still somewhat reasonably valued if you look out into early expectations for calendar year 2025. And the nice thing about companies like Lam is even if we do have another cyclical downturn at some point, or maybe I should say when we have another cyclical downturn at some point, perhaps after calendar year 2026, maybe that's like our early estimate for that. We have put together a lot of visuals trying to illustrate what this actually is going to look like. So here's our timeline, maybe 2026. 2027, maybe even out into 2028, if you believe companies like AMD and the AI infrastructure supercycle. The nice thing about Lam is just like this downturn, they remain profitable, even in some pretty nasty downturns. So that's kind of what we're looking at here as a rough timeline and why we like Lam Research stock.
Thanks for watching this quick update on Lam Research. Make sure you have hit that subscribe button. And if you're interested in having some Discord access with live Q&As, all of our video and published show notes, and free discussion with our investor community, check out the membership on YouTube or over on our Ko-fi channel. Make sure you catch our Visa update this weekend. It's a company that many may not think of when they think of semiconductor stocks, but it very much relies on the foundation of semiconductors. It has held a wonderful place in our portfolio and has given us some great returns. So we finally covered that after the most recent earnings. So catch that episode later this week. Make sure you have notifications enabled, and we'll have more coming your way next week as earnings season rolls on. See you again soon at Chipstock Investor.